Hi, welcome to Literaturely.
A podcast about teaching literature.
I'm Margaret Mock.
And I'm Paige Wallace.
And today we are tackling the single novel.
Yeah. So it's funny that we saw the thread on Twitter asking how you would teach a single novel course, and we had already planned to cover this, so it feels timely.
Yeah, it seems like something that people are thinking about, which is exciting, because it just feels like there's energy around it, you know?
Yeah, and I think I'm interested in it because it's something I've never done before. And it's also something that I was never in a one novel class. Margaret, were you ever in a one novel class?
I was.
Ooh.
I took a Ulysses class in undergrad.
Okay.
So that was actually kind of part of my path to getting my PhD. Was in undergrad. I became very obsessed with Irish literature. I studied abroad in Ireland. I went and got my master's trying to focus on Irish and so on. And now I do modernism, which I was interested in Irish modernism, but so it's just expanded. But
Yeah.
It was a whole class on Ulysses.
Is there pressure that the one novel class will either decide whether they're going to grad school or not?
No, because I'd actually decided this before I took the class.
Okay.
I took this class my second semester senior year. Yeah, it would be second semester senior year. It ended up being a lot of my friends who weren't English majors were in the class. We did not know we were all taking it. I think, which maybe goes into why take a one novel class, which we'll talk about, I know. But there were these non-English majors, my friends who were taking it because they felt like you should read Ulysses by the time you graduate college. Kind of deal. Like there was this idea of it as cultural capital. And if they didn't read it now, they never would. And we were going to walk through it with someone. I'll say that my professor, I probably did not get as much out of the class as I wish I would have. And part of it was just, it was a very, the movie idea of an English class in a lot of ways.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like where there was a lot of like pondering in class.
Did anybody stand on a desk?
No. I did turn in a paper where the last page had gotten pulled off. Or it didn't get stapled, because this was back when you turned in hard copy papers. And I had written about castration anxieties in Ulysses, because of course. And he sent me an email asking me if I had metaphorically castrated my paper.
And you were like, yeah, we'll go with that.
No, because the next part was, because that would not work for a seminar paper. It would be better suited for like an experimental like mediation. I wish I still had the email, but I don't. But I was like, no, it just didn't make it in. I have it. And I think I like attached it to the email. But then he forgot that had happened that same week. And he talked about it in class, like saying like, one time a student did this. And I was like, me, I am the student. And he sent me another email apologizing, which I wasn't hurt by. I thought the whole thing was funny because, like, of course that would happen when you write a paper about like castration, but he was like that sort of scattered professor that just like the whole class was stream of conscious, and he wasn't always in the present moment, it seemed.
Okay.
So it was it was a good class, but it wasn't as focused as maybe I would like a class I taught on a single novel to be.
Yes. Just a different style.
Yeah, a different style.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting, and it was fun to kind of be this mix of English majors, non-English majors. You had people who had read a lot of Joyce before, people who had never read Joyce. So it very much was like in all levels.
I also think maybe for some students, they might be, a certain sect of students might be inclined to take a class that only reads one novel.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if do you want them to take it for that reason? Definitely not for that reason alone, but it might, get some students through the door. And then you have some work to do.
Yeah, that's true. Like to show that one novel doesn't mean
No
no.
reading.
Yeah. So why would you teach a single novel course, Paige?
Well, I think that it's sort of, it takes some of the pressure off. So like it isn't less reading necessarily, but I do think it takes like a little bit of the pressure off to like so like in a normal class you're reading like how many novels? Like 5, 6 novels, right? Um and there's just sort of like a constant like I'm kind of inhaling these novels like as an undergrad, right? And I think a one novel class takes a little bit of that pressure off and gives you time to really sit with a text and do some in-depth kind of work that when you're kind of just going through them, not that you're not doing in-depth stuff, but there's only so much time, right? And for me, as the person teaching the class, I'm constantly sort of like, wow, I wish I had more time for that. I wanted to go into that more, so on and so forth. And one novel kind of gives us that idea of like reading as like critical reading as rereading, and that potential to really sort of scaffold in moments of rereading so that students can see like the value of that, right? Like that it's not always just that first reading, and we know that you know our students have lives and jobs and other classes, and so in a traditional class that's covering a span of novels they don't have time to do that rereading, and so they miss some of that like really like that critical engagement with the text.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Like thinking about, they do probably only read the novel once, even if they're writing a paper on it, because they just go back through to the parts that they think are relevant for their paper. Which again, time management skills. Like that's
Yeah.
what's possible. But I like that idea, and also thinking about sitting with a text and reflection. And I talk about this with my students sometimes, but this that the way academia is set up is that it's very performance oriented, that you have to perform what you learned so that someone can evaluate you. And this is a larger, not problem, but trend. Like with social media, that when we learn something, you have to perform your knowledge of it on social media. So like when a celebrity dies, you have to tweet about it or Instagram about it to like demonstrate that you have heard this information. Um, so I talk about with them like, well, when do you reflect on the knowledge? Like process what, not just what you learned and that you know it, but how does it affect the way you interact with the world, see the world, how
Right.
you identify yourself, like where it fits in with your other knowledge bases. Um, and how even it can just like make you feel. And I don't always love to do like super emotional stuff in my classes, but thinking just sometimes learning can be painful because it challenges us and it forces it. And sometimes just like sitting with that discomfort. Um, but if you have to read 6, 7, 8 novels, you don't have time to sit. So it's easy to dismiss that novel as like, I didn't like that because it made me feel weird. Versus, what was that novel trying to do?
Right.
Why did they show so many insects eating people? Sorry, that was a Burroughs novel.
Yeah.
But
But I mean, you know, like that question of like, or being able to get to questions beyond like, I just liked it or I disliked it.
yeah, and you also, yeah, exactly. And also something you were saying before of like, I don't know what you said that provoked it, but it made me realize that when you read multiple novels in a class, one of the goals is for your students to see the trends throughout all the novels.
Absolutely.
But that means they're reading the novels in light of the novels we've read that semester. So they're going to focus on the themes that have already been brought up by the previous novels or like the symbols that have already been used. And so they won't necessarily focus on other things in the novels they're currently reading because the scaffolding has already taken place. And it would be kind of, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because that's obviously the goal a lot of times if you're focusing like on a specific theme. But with a single novel class, you're not reading that novel necessarily in context of other works. You can, but sometimes you're just assessing that novel itself
Yeah.
and what you want to focus on in it.
We talked a little bit about buy-in. So students thinking that a particular novel has cultural capital, being intrigued by the idea of just covering one novel in a class. Are there any other sort of buy-in moments that you could think of?
I think there's this understanding of like an appreciation for craft
Mm-hmm.
that you can really dive deep into just like art appreciation, which again, like you're not rushing through it, so you can take these moments. This did not happen in a single novel class, but I always think about my professor for postmodern. I think I've referenced him before, but one of the things he did with some of our novels was he would have us look for what he called the tour de force moments, where he was like, it's sort of this self-contained moment of the novel where it's really in its groove. It encapsulates kind of what the novel is all about. And it's just this particularly powerful moment. And I love doing that now when I read novels. Like, oh, this is like the novel's tour de force moment. Like, this is really, it's like kernel. But I don't think they necessarily have to have just one. But thinking about that, like, appreciation for just like, you know what? This is a really strong moment in this novel. Like, this is like, it's like soprano solo. Like, but it really helped me as a student develop that appreciation for craft. Like, what is the novel doing in this moment? How is it crafting such a powerful moment? What techniques are allowing it to do that? How is it presenting themes? And so to be able to do that sort of work with a novel as a whole, I think students would be really interested in. Do you have any other buy-in moments you're thinking about, or?
No, I don't think so. I think that kind of covers really what the buy-in is. And maybe the other part of this would be like your buy-in from your department, right?
Yeah.
Which again, I think that this isn't like, I mean, they're traditional sort of one novel classes.
Yeah.
But if you branch out, right, from Ulysses, you have to make some sort of argument for the value of that text, and spending a whole semester on it.
Yeah. And I think like there's the general arguments you can make in terms of the skills it develops. So not just like appreciation, but really spending that time with one novel allows you to really hone your students like close reading skills, analytical skills, their writing skills, all of that, which could be a buy-in moment for students as well. If you kind of not market it, but in the course description, like talk about this is a chance to develop your informational literacy, your writing skills, etc.
So now that you're saying that, it's making me think about how well this could work for like a second semester comp class.
Yeah.
So again, maybe not a Ulysses text, but something else.
Parable of the Sower.
Yeah,
I was talking to Paige about this the other day, that not in light of the one novel class until you just said it. I'm like, oh, I guess it would be a one novel class if you just did Parable of the Sower. But there's so much about writing
in a comp class. Yeah, that would be really interesting. So definitely. Do we want to talk about some of the assignments that we might? Because that's related to this idea of skills, right?
Yeah. So when I was brainstorming for this, it was really difficult, I think, for me to come up with general assignments. That all the assignments would really depend for me on what the novel is.
That's fair.
And so I think it depends on how you want to structure your course, because you can have it be like where you're using one novel to explore writing or one novel to explore different theoretical lenses and all of that. And so the assignments would shift based off of that, but also the themes in the novel itself. What about you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when I was brainstorming for this, it was really difficult, I think, for me to come up with general assignments. That all the assignments would really depend for me on what the novel is. And so I think it depends on how you want to structure your course, because you can have it be like where you're using one novel to explore writing or one novel to explore different theoretical lenses and all of that. And so the assignments would shift based off of that, but also the themes
Well, I guess I was thinking about whether or not I would have, so let's say we're having a 16-week course.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't think that I would like have a chapter per week or something like that. Like I think that, or it would impact my assignments as to whether or not I did that. Like we're going to spend the entire semester reading the book once through, or we're going to read it in the first half and then reread it in the second half. And that reread would include some group assignments, some annotation assignments, and that's sort of the model that I would lean towards. But I think you're right that it would depend on what text
Yeah.
until the
So
goals.
thinking like when you said one chapter a week, the Ulysses class was essentially one chapter a week. We read the first 3 chapters together, and then I think after that it was about a chapter a week. But that's just because it's so long. And thinking about typically the one novel classes are just those beasts of a novel at like so Paradise Lost, Moby Dick, Crime and
Right.
Punishment, like, but I don't think they necessarily have to be beasts. Like what you were saying, you can reread a text and build that into the semester. And I was thinking about that with the novel Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay, which is 16 chapters. And I was thinking you could read the novel probably in the first quarter of the semester, like 4 chapters a week, something around there. And for those of you who have never read it, Picnic at Hanging Rock is about a disappearance that these students mysteriously vanish one day on a picnic from a school in Australia. And the novel is like about the fallout. And you never find out what happened to them, except the author had a very specific reason of what happened to them. So I think it'd be fun to read the novel first with no knowledge of what happened to them, and then read it again, but rather in 4 weeks, in 2 weeks, since it's more familiar with that knowledge of this is what happened. So how does it affect your reading? That still leaves about half the semester. I think with that, I would really want to do group work, to have students broken up into small groups, each group working with a single theme or image that comes up again and again throughout the novel. So like Picnic at Hanging Rock, I was thinking like sirens, mermaids, flowers, family, some others. And then the class as a whole is working with the idea of time. And I was thinking of like what kind of group work they would do. Like I think presentation where they talk about it, maybe like some flash essays that they work together on. And then also maybe doing some archival work, like allowing it to be a research class where if we're digging deep, let's see how deep we can go. But that's, again, because Picnic at Hanging Rock isn't that long of a text. So I don't think it would work necessarily with everything else. But you also wanted to do a 2-read.
I was also thinking about how much reading, like number of pages do I assign per week, and is that realistic? And I was like, you know what, that's something that I need to trace more in my teaching, is because I think about units and assigning text based on like whatever unit we're working on, and page numbers vary, and I think that, you know, that's something you can't escape. But like, what's the min max that you assign per week? And so that's a thing that I kind of want to crowdsource a little, like in terms of like what do other people think the min max is. Because I would do Richard Powers' The Overstory, which is what I have it here. So it's like 500 pages. It's, yeah. Realistically, I think you could read that twice in a single semester.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what I would do is I would have them, we would read it through once, and I would pair each section with like an critical text, and then I would have them read it a second time, having that knowledge, right? So like now you have the sort of understanding of eco-criticism as a whole, and the trends and the changes and the trajectories, at least like somewhat, right? And we might do some sort of like timeline sort of group assignments, right, for the different like you know, like what about post-colonial eco-criticism, feminist eco-criticism, the timeline between like critical race theory and civil rights and eco-crit and poverty, and so on and so forth. during a first read. And then a second read, I would really focus on the idea of roots and rhizomatic knowledge, and how to trace different sort of themes and ideas visually through the text, because there are a lot of places that it was hard for me to connect dots with this text. And so I think having students sort of think through like how they see connections would be helpful. And with the reread, I don't know if I'd make them reread the entire text, or if I'd let them as a group choose sections that they wanted to work with and map out.
Oh, fun.
And so, because each of the sections is sort of this, could be read as a kind of story of its own. And so what happens when you unpack those on their own? What happens when you pair them together and unpack? Like, is there potential for group, like if this is a group assignment, for one group to do Patricia's story and then another group to do Douglas's story, and then
so like go through it by characters?
Well, I mean, and that's how the sections are arranged, is by like the characters. I mean, later we get trunk, crown, and seeds, right? I mean, so there are different ways that they're arranged. Thinking about that structure, like trunk, crown, and seeds, what kind of things could they pull from it to create that sort of network knowledge now that they have read the entire thing in conjunction with some eco-crit theory?
I like too that allows you, that image of the tree allows you to play both with like the surface level initial reading and then going underneath the surface, like what you're saying with roots of that second, third reading. Like that's where you're getting deeper into it, of not just that what are you seeing, but what's happening underneath this.
Yeah. And I think I would have like minor assignments, like a presentation where they do like an artifact, like you know, a weird world artifact that is in this text, but also like, so national parks pop up in the text, right? And what's a sort of examination of a national park, and the sort of weirdness that happens, right, with like selfie culture in national parks. And yeah,
I think I was actually thinking of a class similar to that, but it's on the flip side. So rather than thinking necessarily about theory, thinking about ways texts build off of other texts, taking a novel that is incredibly, well, all novels I think are referential to an extent, but a novel that you're familiar with those references, that you can help your students work through it and pair it with those texts that it's reading. So even though on the surface level you're doing a one novel class, you're actually reading a number of other works of fiction.
Right.
They might be short stories or excerpts of novels. Like you won't necessarily read a whole nother novel, but to see how cultural works respond to cultural works, that is the ongoing conversation. And how do we not only identify those references, but how do those references give meaning? How do those references show a shift over time, that the way we are interpreting these works and responding to them? How do they show this evolution in language and so on? And I think if I taught that sort of class, I would actually do it as a class about the ethics of annotation, which I talk about. But thinking about like, what do we focus on in a text? What do texts see as culturally valuable? Like if a text is referencing something, it's seeing it as culturally valuable. So what gets included, what doesn't? How would you choose to annotate it? So I'd want to pick a novel that was in public domain. So that would be our ongoing assignment over the course of the semester. Students would be building this digital annotation of the text, and their final paper would not be a term paper. It would be sort of this reflection on, what do you now think are the ethics of annotations? At what point are we overwriting a text and all of that? And so they would be reading these other fictional works, but also short critical texts throughout the semester on annotation, on literary criticism, and that sort of work. But
yeah, I love that. I think that like the idea of doing like a semester long annotation project is very appealing to me.
I really want to do it. obviously I have never done it, so I can't imagine the pitfalls, and I'm sure there are many. But
Yeah.
I'd be really excited to hear if anyone's done something like that, because I do think it's becoming not a popular assignment, but I think it's something people are doing more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I also have thought through how I could use overstory the overstory in like an American literature like nature writing survey course, and kind of in that way of pairing it with other shorter text, probably not other novels, but excerpts and things that sort of give us that trajectory, right? Or that survey of American literature, specifically nature writing.
Yeah, because even though we talked in the beginning about like really appreciating one novel, not rushing through it with other texts, and I talked about not reading it in light of other texts, but I do think it's important for students to understand that nothing exists in a vacuum. Something's always responding to something.
Yeah, and I think that when you're talking about specifically like not reading it with other text, that's different than what we're saying with
Yeah,
reading it
like
with other text.
limiting to like a one theme that unites a number of different texts, rather
Right.
than what are all the number of themes one text can hold.
Yeah, and like when you like you said, when you read a novel in conjunction in a class with other novels, they're influencing the readings, right?
Which, so I guess my brain broke thinking about all of these. I'm going to totally pivot and say, because I've been hypothesizing with you now about like texts that I would want, or classes I would want to teach but never have.
Mm-hmm.
When we were preparing for this episode, it did occur to me that I have taught a single novel course, but not in the traditional sense. I did it for the Intro to English Studies class, where
Right.
we had to cover poetry, drama, and fiction. But I was teaching in the summer course, so I had to do it all in 6 weeks. And they had certain required assignments they had to do. So the way I chose to balance it was we were only going to read one novel as our fiction. And I chose Madeleine Miller's Cersei, which I think came out 2017, 2015.
I think so. Yeah.
And it's her telling of the story of Cersei, the sorceress from the Odyssey, but she links it with a lot of other Greek mythology and creates this epic. And I was interested in this idea of sort of creating a modern epic, but I used it. So all of our poetry were adaptations of Greek mythology, interpretations of the original Odyssey. For drama, we watched a movie, and we watched Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And so it was all working towards reading this novel with the Odyssey in mind, and how was she adapting the Odyssey. I think though you could flip it where you're not leading up to the novel, but you use the novel to sort of start out with.
Right.
And again, think through the background of the myth. When we actually read the novel, I paired different chapters with different critical texts that weren't about the novel itself. It was like how we use monsters to represent disability and vice versa, and we need new ways to consider disability in cultural artifacts. Talking about like transformation in myths, and what does that symbolize in our psyches, our cultural psyches. So it was like all these different, basically teaching them like these are the different theoretical lenses some scholars use to analyze work. Not saying any of these are the best or worst, they're just
right.
what's available. So it was sort of like a maybe theory overview, but it felt more like a close reading. Like these are all the information you need to close read a text. And so the assignments we did with that, we started with the annotations, then we started with a review, and then for the review they were focusing on a theme, and then they expanded that to their literary analysis. And it was they talked about it at the end of class that on one hand they liked that they were able to build those skills, and it really allowed us to practice them in class and get more feedback, but on the other hand they were really done with the novel by the end.
And that was only 6 weeks.
3 weeks, really. It's a longer novel, but it's an easy read that you can probably read it in a weekend, like the average reader. So it does make me think you would need sort of complicated texts that
Right.
really you have to unpack. I think an easy read, they're going to be like, yeah, what I read it. I don't need to.
And so like that, one of the things we pointed out when we were putting this together is that a lot of the books that we came up with off the bat are men. That's fine, but our list is a lot of men. I was thinking about someone like Barbara Kingsolver and the Poisonwood Bible. It's about 500 pages. And have you ever read that, Margaret?
I haven't.
Okay. I think it could be a really interesting conversation about like colonialization and religion and indoctrination and sort of, and then there's all these sort of environmental themes as well. But I also think that it's a book that you can get through pretty quickly, not because there are not things to unpack. There are things to unpack there, but I don't know, maybe I just like, it's a book that I read fairly quickly. It draws you in, and so there are positives to that, but also my worry would be that students would sort of inhale it and then be ready to move on from it quicker.
And I did see that, so we referenced that there was a Twitter thread about it, and I did see that come up in one of the responses, that someone talked about how their students were kind of sick of it by the end, and so they actually readjusted the rest of their semester accordingly, like talked with their students like, well, do you want to read something else? And they agreed to that. So I think there has to be a willingness to change course when teaching a class like this and to readjust. You might want a backup plan going into it.
Well, I wonder if then it would even make sense to have some sort of like large project at the end of this.
Yeah.
Where you're spending class time working on that and like collaboratively working on a large project might help. Because I imagine some of it is just the monotony, not to say like that, the discussions are monotonous, but coming every day to talk about the same book, you'd have to do something to sort of not just kind of immediately go to the same themes over and over, the same points, or the same stylistic conversations or whatever, to just avoid that monotony.
I think it would be really fun to do an online exhibit, which I often assign, so I'm biased.
Yes.
But building like you could have your students sign up to be on different committees, and like they work together to assemble what they think are the essential artifacts for this, and you work as a class together for how do you want to do the design layout to make it cohesive. But you could do like the one committee is focusing on like the primary materials, so thinking about like the author's drafts, the author's maybe like letters, things like that, photographs, whatever else. You could have one on like the committee of like the historical context, one committee on adaptations or
Right.
things like, and there's a number of other things you could do. You could also break it down by theme, like one on gender, one like, or
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and I was gonna say, then you could give students the option to choose their own text to read, to add to the conversation. And that could be really cool. Like, and it could be a group style. So like the first half of the semester could be focused on your text, your single text, and then the second half focused on that exhibit, and then have them do some sort of like book club, right? Like your group chooses a book to read and you come up with your own discussion questions and how some sort of reflection as to why you chose it and what it has to do with your one novel, and then contribute that to the online exhibit as well.
Yeah, that would be cool. I also like the idea of building a class where you're really teaching the students like, how do you find valuable, I keep saying artifacts because I don't want to just say theory or critical works, because it's not just that, though that's an important part of it. And I say that because I feel like our students know how to do key term searches. They know how to find, articles and books that are tangential to their arguments, their work, but they don't necessarily know how to find like, oh, this text is something that's foundational for the field. They don't know how to delve into an archive, and that's not on them. That's because they've never been taught that. I feel like I had to teach myself that during grad school. And so what if we use the one novel class to really help them develop their research skills, their information literacy skills, and their ability to compile information on a subject. That's not just, oh, this is all about the same key term, but these are the texts I think that help you best understand this work. And you can only do that, I think, over the course of an entire semester. That's like, that sort of skill building takes time. It takes years, but at the very least months. So I think being able to scaffold that throughout the semester without also balancing 6 different novels, their individual contexts, like,
right,
would allow you more space to do that.
I also was just thinking briefly about how this class would work in a face-to-face class versus like an online class. Because I almost think that an online, like, it could make for a really interesting online class.
Tell me more.
Well, I guess I was just thinking about like the idea of balancing multiple texts in one semester and developing skills for research and archival research, like an online class that focused on one book, right? So it's almost like, okay, I've got the book down, right? Like I've read it. Now I'm working on these like periphery skills, and I'm already in an online space. So yeah, that's not fully thought out, but I think it would. I just wonder, like, would it work better in an online versus a face-to-face? Or, I mean, maybe, maybe that's not even a good question to ask.
No, I think it is a good question in that everything I've been thinking has still been very discussion-based, which we have learned in this past year. Discussions on Zoom, no matter how great they are just more draining than they are face-to-face because it's harder to read body language. But you bring up a good point of, what are the benefits of a one novel class in terms of non-seminar discussion assignments that you can pursue? And that you were kind of alluding to this earlier, that one of the drawbacks of a one novel class is that in-person discussion grows stale at a certain point. So I think there is maybe something to that the assignments you'd have to do aren't necessarily those face-to-face conversations.
Right.
So I don't have much more to say on what those assignments would be and how they would work in online spaces. But...
Well, I mean, I think like your sort of exhibit, right? Your cultural artifacts exhibit, if it's like a working exhibit, like one that you're adding to throughout the semester.
Yeah.
And responding to in different ways, right? Because again, like, blog posts get stale, right?
You was thinking too, going back to Picnic at Hanging Rock, like, say you had a group of students who their key term, like I said, was like, or key theme was the use of mermaids and mermaid imagery. And like, why? Like, just investigating, like, what's the purpose of this imagery? Why is she incorporating this? We're like in the Australian outback, so what's with all the mermaids? It would almost allow you to help your students rethink their own ideas, which is something I always want to convey to my students. And I say it to them, but I don't think they ever truly believe it. But that idea of like, hey, your first idea isn't necessarily going to be
your best.
Yeah. Or even what you think after spending 2 months really ruminating over it. So like, we don't have to commit to that. But if you give them that theme at the beginning, and we do these 2 readings of the novel, and they're kind of like, yes, it would be stale, but like, I'm rabbit holing here, folks. So
keep going.
Bear with me. But I keep thinking about a book Paige and I both recently read, Don DeLillo's Point Omega, and one of the characters writes an essay on a single word. Now I can't remember what that single word was. Do you remember, Paige? It was like rendition. I think it was rendition or render.
Render. It was render.
Render.
It's render.
And so he writes this essay about render with all the etymology, the connections, the different meanings of the word. And part of it is that departure from the departure, that the word doesn't mean what it means.
Right.
And I think that would work well for thinking about a literary symbol. The word doesn't mean what it means. The image isn't what it depicts. And so to warp that and allow them to rabbit hole, like just like I'm doing right now over the semester, and maybe somehow track that, where it's, I don't know entirely, like maybe we have like multiple Google Docs so they can see that evolution of their ideas and have it be somewhat quantifiable. And as they're researching more about mermaids and like the mythology of it, what literary theorists have had to say about it, like all these different approaches, and then at the end, what's their final take on it, quote unquote final.
It's almost like I don't know, like investigative journalism a little bit, you know? Like
I was thinking meditation, but I think investigative journalism is more exciting and truer.
Yeah.
But yeah, just coming at it again and again and seeing what you unpack. And I think you'd have to really work hard to keep it fresh for them. So they can't just phone it in and like regurgitate what they did last time and have it become monotonous.
Then that has to be one of the objectives, right? To not be passive readers and sort of accept a role as investigating the text, and what do you need to do to investigate it, and to not just sort of passively accept a reading of it or engage, like it, you know, for that engagement to be that passive, like here's what's happening plot wise.
Which, to do that, you could get really creative with your teaching. Like you'd have to force yourself to give these new assignments on things you've taught before, but you have to do it again and again. You can't just assign the same thing every week. Like, and so you can have like one time your students focus on the imagery of whatever you're talking about, but another week, like, and where they're working together to unpack it. But the next week, have that small group divide themselves into two, and they have to debate each other and like really interrogate their ideas. And then another week, like, synthesize what other people have said. I don't know.
It's one of those classes that would take a lot of scaffolding, right?
Yes.
Because if you just go in and depend on like that discussion, like / lecture format, it would get old.
And you'd have to be really transparent with your students. Like explain to them, this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. So that way they understand clearly the objectives. I think sometimes we go over the objectives the first day of the semester, and then we just rely on our students to know what we're doing.
See how they're connected. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to make the connection so that way they see the work is valuable, because otherwise they're like, yeah, we're talking about that passage again. It's like, no, but this time.
I think the other part of transparency for this is especially like for me and you to say like, we've not done this before. And so embedding some reflective assignments in terms of like, how is this working? And like you said, being flexible to switch it up if it's, you know, crashing and burning.
I think have a backup text in mind. Like if I was thinking before about like Donna Tartt. If I was going to do like one of her novels, maybe have either like another one of her works or maybe like a Bret Easton Ellis novel to show like that kind of crossover author collaboration.
Because we've all been in the situation where we were really jazzed about teaching a novel and it just goes really poorly.
I don't know what you're talking about, Paige. That's never happened to me.
Okay, well, it's happened. Yeah. So, and you just cannot wait to finish that unit, those weeks of reading that, and move on to something else because it just didn't hit the way you wanted it to. You know, you're not sharing it the way that you intended to.
What if I taught Corregidor as my one novel course? I wish everyone could see your face right now.
Margaret, I support you. If you what you go with what you think.
Honestly, though, I say that as like a kidding, just because we know I love to teach that novel so much, but the students hate it. But the thing is, the more they reflect on it, the more they're like, that novel does what it wants to do really well. And I wonder how would it be over a semester.
Okay, just let it be a summer semester, okay?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it would have to be a summer semester. But even then, the snakes start to eat its own tail by the end. I think, and that's the other thing, just because you love a text does not mean you want to spend 16 weeks with it.
Yeah, I mean, and just because you didn't love a text doesn't mean you can't spend 16 weeks with it, because I didn't love the overstory.
So I feel like I have a lot of ideas now, but not too much more to say at this point. Burning thoughts?
No, I can't think of any. Do you want to tell us your dream class, Margaret?
Yes, I've been talking about Picnic at Hanging Rock so much today that it is part of my dream course now, along with Point Omega, which I also talked about. I think it'd be really fun to teach a class about disappearance, like people who mysteriously vanish with no explanation. And I want to teach this because my objective would be having my students consider a satisfactory work, and in terms of like how much information they're given. So like, do you have to know what happens to feel satisfied? Do you need a happy ending to feel satisfied? The answer, I think, to both are no, but what makes it satisfactory then? And really interrogating like what a novel needs to do to leave the audience feeling fulfilled. And I think you could pair that with a lot of potential criticism, like starting with like Aristotle's theory of tragedy and like thinking about is it the catharsis that's enough? Is it like sort of the questions it provokes? What's going on here? So, I would include Picnic at Hanging Rock, Point Omega, maybe Lisa Coe's The Leavers, in which you do find out what happened to the character, and some other ones, but that I think would just be really fun. But also, since we just talked about that monotony, maybe by the end, my students would never want to like read like a kidnapping or vanishing story again. But who knows? What about you?
Okay, I want to teach a class that's like just on series, like a novels, works that are part of series. And so like maybe Octavia Butler, Earthseed, and then like what happens when the series, like a trilogy isn't finished, Vandermeer and the Southern Reach trilogy. I don't think I would do Lord of the Rings, but obviously I'm going to throw it out there. Maybe Madeleine L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time, and that is a series. And so like just this idea of like creating worlds that travel across books, right? And like with Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower, and then like the first and the second books are from different perspectives. And that she does that a lot, and so what happens when the world is shown to us from a different perspective, so on and so forth. Oh my God, though, I was just thinking, I was like, would I do Dune? But would I do that as like a one novel class?
It's funny you say that because you got me thinking about one novel classes where I was thinking Dorothy Richardson's Painted Roofs series, where it's like 11 novels. We're like, but can you do that as a one novel course? Like, would a series count?
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. Like, could a series count? Is that like a loophole to the one? I mean, I think it's a one author class.
True, but what if you only read their series? Like, is it still a one author if you're not reading any of their other works?
I don't know. Yeah.
That's like is a hot dog a sandwich question.
It is. I don't know the answer to it.
I guess we'll have to figure it out for next week.
Yes, maybe. Probably not. I think we're moving on next week. It's too late.
Well, until then.
All right, Margaret.